So now to our facilitators. I'd like to introduce Sharon Fraser. Sharon is a CFI network member and also a founding director of Clarion Call. She's got extensive on-the-ground experience in implementation of collective impact, systems change and collaborative practice across Australia. And we've got Jennifer Chaplin, another CFI network member and founding director in Clarion Call. Jen is known for helping people to break through barriers in thinking and practice, embracing diversity and engaging people with lived experience to create change. We also have David Lilley, again, a CFI network member and principal of Hollis Consulting. David has worked on place-based collaborations as a practitioner, researcher and advisor in roles that have spanned government, the social sector, academia and consulting. Dave, Jen and Sharon have all contributed to the development of Platform C, which is our online learning space to help communities, organisations and practitioners on their collaborative change journey for systems change. This is the first webinar we've run as Platform C, so we're excited. And with that, let's get underway. I'm going to hand over to Jen Chaplin.
There you go, first glitch. Turn your mic on, thank you. Hi everyone, so my name's Jennifer Chaplin and I'm joining you today from Whadjuk Noongar land in Western Australia. And I just wanted to take a second to introduce us one step further because we are all joining from around the country. So I'll have Sharon and David hop on. But to do that, I wanted to share with you all that I met David when I first came into the field. I was given the task of starting a collective impact project when the field was really new and thought, oh, what am I going to do? And I started calling people, and every person I called, I asked who's the next person I should call. And David was one of the very first people I called. And what I discovered early on was people that were really committed were also really honest. And I thought, well, I'm stuck to David for life because he actually guided me through this early journey. And when I joined Collaboration for Impact, I met Sharon in very much the same way. And we resonated around practice and our beliefs around this way of working. So I guess to say that in addition to being your three facilitators today, we're also really keen collaborators together. And I learned so much from David and Sharon in my own practice. So with that, I will hand to you, Sharon, to say hi before we get started.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. And we were chatting beforehand around how this conversation is really what people are calling for at the moment. People have a sense of what this thing is academically, but people are wanting to work out how to do this. And I'm really pleased to be here today to be on this journey with Jennifer and David.
I'll just say a quick hello, and I'll add a little bit to what Jen said. It's quite clarifying that, that Sharon and I met at a similar time and had a very similar experience too. You know, Sharon was working in Victoria, I was working in New South Wales, you know, miles apart, and we really resonated around, you know, a sort of underlying set of values and a mindset to this sort of work. So hopefully that will come across in the way that we talk to all of you today.
Thanks, guys. Just wanted to take a second to orient everyone to the conversation today. I know that you've all signed up and read about the purpose, but just to restate again, the purpose is to take you through the lens of one approach to systems change using the lens that we refer to as the collaborative change cycle, which is collective impact in the real world, in a sense. And so today isn't about, to Sharon's point, it's not about what is it. The field has been around now for a while, but the question's about how do we really do this? What does it look like? Given that on paper, sometimes it can look like a bit of a roadmap or a recipe. Our goal today is to really bring it to life and provide some useful information. The way that we're going to do that is, for those of you that really like to understand what's going to happen, we are kind of narrating our way through the change cycle. And to do that, we're going to talk about what the phase is, what it really looks like, and give you some real examples from the real world. And Sharon and I are going to do that as a bit of an armchair chat. And David is going to capture and share back at the end of that. And our brief to David was edgy feedback, I think, David, which we know. So this is all about the pulling back the curtain and looking at what this thing looks like when it really lives and breathes. And we've invited, as Gabby said, we've invited you to post questions in chat, and Gabby's going to be keeping an eye on that as we go along. David and Sharon, is there anything I need to add before we jump in? Because now I'm handing over to myself. So in the interest of handing over to myself, I'm stepping us into the change cycle. The first phase of that is referred to as the readiness runway. But in fact, like all great adventures, there's a pre-step. It's not a case of, right, we're gonna do a collective impact project and we're gonna roll it out. When we're considering this stuff in the early days, we really want to take a step back and have a think about what is the size and scale of the change we think we're seeking. And I say think because we're going to be always reflecting as we go along. But sometimes the most important thing in the end is, say, service integration around maybe even a hub for children and families. And that may not require an approach of this scale. For example, it still requires diversity, requires walking alongside people with lived experience, but it's horses for courses. And so wanted to bear in mind that it's not a recipe or a process. What the change cycle in essence is a series of touchstones, that some of which are bigger at certain times and some of which we're trying to move along. But we actually, before we even start, want to stop and think. Also wanted to acknowledge that how this work gets catalyzed can happen in a number of ways. So government can kick it off. Government has a way of seeing what's happening across large population sets through data. But just because something starts a certain way doesn't mean it's held that way all the way along. So wanted to shout out at the start to the role that government and philanthropy play, in addition to service system and community. Sharon, what do you want to add about the kind of getting ready to step into it?
Yeah, I think you're right, Jen. And I think the thing that really happens at this point, it's often called building readiness, but in many ways it's finding where the readiness is. So often it can start with just 2 or 3 or 5 people who are dissatisfied with how things are playing out. You know, we've been looking at children going into care for years and nothing's changing, or young people are still sleeping rough on the streets, or why isn't there enough emergency housing? So there's often a discontent that people come together around. And that core group are very critical at this early stage of finding the readiness, and by having lots of conversations. And the conversations at this time are small. They only need to be one-on-one, and it's very much about exploring what is happening. Do you know who is interested in this stuff? Have you got any sense about is there anybody else who's calling for this sort of change as well? There is a temptation at this early phase to jump in boots and all and to try and create a Taj Mahal of collective impact, when really what you're wanting to do at this early stage is really understand where is the energy and who's holding that energy. Jen, you've got this real sense about how data's held at this part of the work, and I think it'd be really good to share that.
Thanks. So just to recap where we are, like we've stepped into what we've referred to as the readiness runway, but it's about finding where people are at, finding that core group of people, not to your point, sharing the Taj Mahal, or I always talk about worshiping at the Church of Systems Change, or, collective impact. Like, we just want to find people that, I always ask myself, like that Christmas carol, do you see what I see? Because in the start, it might be just a couple of people who think they see something, and we want to check rather than roll it out. And so what's been fascinating for me in this journey is to understand the role of data, because I always used to say to people, I'm not an evaluator. I don't work in measurement, evaluation, and learning. And I actually discovered I do, but it looks different in the early phases. And so because we want to use data to inform design and decision-making the whole way through. And so one of the really important things we want to do early on is learn how to play with data. And by data, I mean information, quantitative, qualitative, formal, informal. And so what we're doing in this early stage is going out and finding out what people see and think, and starting to gather some data for conversation. So it's not, sometimes, I remember someone said to me once, they thought we were looking through the AEDC, the Australian Early Development Census. And this was around this stuff, building, what do we think is happening here? And the response was, wow, we thought data was going to give us all the answers. And all it's done is give us a million questions. And I thought, then you were on exactly the right journey, because we want to use data for exploration. Data is not something some mysterious wizard uses behind the curtain. Data's power. And so to start to find simple ways to ask questions and gather information that we explore together is really powerful. And I'm thinking, Sharon, you had a story about data early on, didn't you, when we were talking today?
Absolutely. At this phase of really finding where the readiness is and trying to bring that all together, I've seen data used to help build that story. And often it's looking for a data piece that has both head and heart in it. So where I've seen that used well was in working in family violence. And there was one piece of data in this community that had 73% of family violence incidents in the community had a child or young person present. Was that good enough? And so it is a piece of data that tells a story. Sometimes that piece of data that tells a story might be one of strength. So it might be, isn't it interesting that when we had COVID and we set aside some of our systems barrier around food security went up by 20%. So you see what I mean? It's around finding a piece of data that helps you tell the story. And you don't have to have a PhD in data analysis. It's just really around finding some of that publicly accessible data. And I think that speaks to, Jen, something that you were saying about the story that you're building needs to sit in the context that you have. So sometimes people try and take, oh, well, we saw this done really well in this community when they were starting off, so we're going to do exactly the same here, where the community itself might be at a very different phase. So one community over here might be willing to start something and take off and jump into action, whereas another community might be waiting for someone to come along and save them. And just as a bit of cross-referencing, on Platform C, there's some great work by the Harwood Institute, by Rich Harwood, that helps you unpack to think about where your community might be in terms of their rhythm.
And that reminds me of two things, Sharon. And one is that desire, like, I love a good list. And Sharon and I resonate around this work because we use this change cycle in completely different ways, because we think really differently. And so I love a good plan and I love to know what to do. But what just resonated with me with what you were saying, Sharon, was it's great to go find out what others did, but it's the practice, not the question, not the exact process. And the Harwood work around listening and having conversations is so critical. I used to have a challenge with that because I think, oh, it's not going to give me the data. It's not going to give me answers, but actually it builds trust, relationships, and it weaves people into that conversation. The idea of open questioning and listening with people. And the story that I have around data is actually one that Carrie Graham told me years ago, and it's stuck with me and I share it now. So it was one around a community that wanted to improve early literacy. And so the data, rather than going to find formal existing data, they gathered, and apologies, Carrie, if I've tweaked this story over the years in my own mind, they got 5 volunteers to ask questions in the community. And the questions were things like, do you read to your child before bed? Do you go to story time at the library? They were really simple questions. And each of the 5 people asked 10 people. So they had 50 bits of data. They wrote it on butcher's paper and they put it in the community hall, and they had a morning tea, and they invited everyone who responded to come and see what they said and think about it together. 2 minutes, Gabby, thank you. And in the course of having a chat and walking around, a huge number of people realized there was story time at the hall. And so already change starts to happen by what we ask. Like, it wasn't then turned into a strategy and rolled out as a program. It was just like, oh, we didn't know that, or we didn't know other people thought that, or that's what's happening. And so by focusing on this idea of data and information in informal ways, it actually opens up a huge amount. And the more we formalize these processes early and set ourselves on a path, it's like we're going from a 10-lane highway to the dirt lane on the side of the road. You know, we narrow the scope of everything too quickly sometimes. And so informal, open, and curious are the things that really stand out to me from this phase.
Yeah,
Sharon, do you want to add?
Absolutely. The other thing that stands out to me too is not to step too quickly into the major convening. You know.
Sharon, sorry, Sharon,
Yes.
I'm just going to interrupt. Could you just push your mic away a little? There's feedback.
Yeah,
Just
no problem.
Yeah. Okay.
No drama.
Thank you.
No drama. It's not to step into the major convening too soon, so that it's really around having lots of conversation with lots of diverse opinions, so you've still got the diversity of opinion coming in there, but you're not trying to build something too much too soon. I think we're about ready for our David. David, would you like to come in with your reflections?
That's my cue. Look, a couple of reflections. The first one, which is probably where you ended, Sharon, is on where these conversations start. And earlier it was mentioned that they often start with discontent, you know, a frustration with what's going on. And I think that's really important, because if there is not something wrong, why would you go through the stress and agony of trying to collaborate with people? Because it's not easy. I think some of the things that were said there were around getting a core group, you know, finding like-minded people to get things moving. And there was also some talk about data that enables conversations rather than data that's scientifically telling you, you know, exactly what's happening or what should happen. It's more, what are we sensing from the data and what can we do with it? Then jump and make a little bit of a distinction. So that's sort of starting the conversation, but starting the sort of real guts of collaboration, I think, is different. And the Harwood approach was also mentioned. And while the change cycle that we use is slightly different, Harwood also has a 5-stage process that they work through. And Rich Harwood would say you can't really do collective impacts until you get to stage 3 or 4. And, you know, the language might be a little bit different in our cycle and all those sorts of things. But I think until you get right into it, you're not really doing anything that you could call collective impact. It's more exploratory and it's more open to different paths that could be gone down. With that, I guess the other thing that I heard was about practice, and this is about practices and not about plans. And, you know, I think that goes to values and mindset. And really what that, I think, is wrapped up in is purpose. This is not getting fixated on collaboration or collective impact or a cycle. It's being fixated on purpose. It's saying there's something that a group of us want to achieve, and we'll use whatever process, whatever tools, whatever data we need to work towards and with our purpose. And a very quick couple of quotes before I go. One is from Mike Tyson. I hope I get this right. He said something like, everyone has a plan until it gets punched in the mouth. And I think that's a little bit what this is like. You know, we fall into the trap of business as usual. We create the plan and then bang, we're thrown off course, and that's okay. We adjust and we adapt and we move forward and keep running towards purpose. The other thing I'll mention super quickly is this book. I'm not sure if people can see that. It's called Yes to the Mess, and it uses the analogy of jazz for collaboration. It says, you know, you've got an orchestra, and that's your carefully tuned plan that people like to come up with. But jazz is a closer analogy to collaboration. It's a bit messy. Different people step up and lead at different times, but when you get in the right kind of groove, the right rhythm, you can do amazing things.
Beautiful. That's a nice segue into building the foundations, I think, David, because in order to have those musicians come together to play the same jazz piece rather than different pieces, it's really about making sure that you have enough structure and process in place to help the work happen. What often happens at this phase is people start building governance structures and processes, and it's like the building of the foundations is seen as that. It's seen as what's our leadership table and what do they need to do, and what's our working groups and what do they need to do, etc. When really the foundations that you're wanting to build at this phase is the thinking or the mindset that you really want to come at this work with, and also support others to come at this work with. And the other significant piece of foundation at this phase is around power, and how power is held, and how there is equity, and how you hold some of the systemic power imbalances in the work. So, for example, how there is systemic power imbalances with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So how do you hold that? And they're complex ideas, but there are practical ways that we can build this through. There are practical ways that we can start approaching this. Just to step into that, in terms of one of the practical ways around the structures and the processes is only build what you need when you need it. If there's a call for some data work to be done and you'd like to get some different people to work on it, then maybe you pull together a data working group. If there's a piece of work that you want to explore about the voice of young people, you might pull together a group to do that. It's very much about putting in the processes and the structures that are needed to do the work at this time. In talking about the mindsets and the attitudes, this is something that you and I have chatted about quite a bit, Jen. And one of the things around mindsets is about, of course, getting that diverse voice in. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, it's funny. I was making notes as you were talking, and because Sharon and I were thinking, oh my gosh, we could run away with this and the three of us could talk forever. But the interesting thing about diversity links closely with power. So I just want to take a step back to pick up on something you said around power, Sharon, because I was having a conversation with a team just this week around, we were talking about equity and sharing power. And someone in the group said, actually, that assumes that it's visible in the first place. And so that's we talk about working with power, and we need to do that to collaborate, to hold divergent views, like to manage conflict, and to embrace it as well. But we actually need to work really hard to make this stuff visible. And sometimes we need to work really hard to make it visible to ourselves. So one of the things we hear a lot in systems change is like everyone else is the problem. Oh, that system over there, they've got to change. But what we discover at every single step is it's us. And by us, I mean all of us, because we're all part of an ecosystem. And so if we're really mining for making things visible, then we need a lot of diverse views. And this is every kind of diversity, age, gender, culture, language, because we think differently. It's not, a colleague sent me a funny loony cartoon about the tinfoil hat, and the tinfoil hat is for the other guy that thinks differently than you do. And I thought, well, we all need our tinfoil hats, and we need to really seek out how other people see things differently. And so when we talk about diverse leadership tables in this, we usually break it down to government, service system, business industry, and people with lived experience / community. It's not like, oh, I come to this town and I work for a service, so I'm going to wear the community hat too. To David's point about we're here to solve something and address something, we can't do that without the context experts. We need content experts and context experts. And so the diversity is multi-layered and multifaceted.
I think, Jen, one of the things that brings up for me too is that often when we come into meetings and come into to do a piece of work, we come in as a role. So we'll come in because I've got this position in this organisation, etc. And sometimes when you do some unpacking about all of the different roles that people have in the community or in their lives, you often find that there's a depth of experience and a depth of knowledge in the room that you had not realised was there. So, for example, in some work that I was involved in Central Victoria, we used to start each meeting with a story that people would bring into the room about themselves or about something that had happened or something that wasn't to do with their employment. Or we would get them to come into the room to tell something about something they had seen or observed in the community and what they thought about or felt about that. So that at the very start of the meeting, it's setting a different tone to have a different sort of conversation to what you would normally have. So it's around how you bring people in to have that conversation. Sometimes too, around the power piece, I often think, look, there's lots of ways of making power overt. A lot of the books around it are organisational power based. They're not so much around how you work across power in an ecosystem, etc. But it really doesn't matter which one of those you use, as long as there's a way of discussing, oh, this is formal or informal power, or this is social power, as long as you've got a shared language for a group to actually unpick, oh, this is our shared understanding about what power is, and this is what I think I have. I think I've got some formal power because I hold this position, but I've also got some social power because I volunteer down at the whatever, etc. So as long as there's a way of having that conversation to have an understanding, and then the other way that I have found bringing the power out is when you do get talking about the work together, then having the conversation about, if we want to move this, what power do we need to bring to it and who's got it in our system? So it's like you're saying, Jen, the more that you can overt that and make it a real part of the work rather than something that we're trying to hide or control or manipulate subtly in the background.
You got me thinking when you talked about the we are part of an ecosystem, and one of the examples I had around this is actually something that just happened last week, and that was I'm working with a group in Western Australia that started off being generated out of government, and it's around addressing obesity. So it's a really big issue. It's through health. It's quite complex, and we had our first in-person workshop after about a year with COVID of trying to work out the best way to bring people together. And the first one was quite formal. You know, we brought everyone in a room and we explored it. And I mean, it was fine. And we got pretty good feedback, but we started to wonder whether we'd focused enough on the individuals, because we had to do the thing where we talked about structure and the journey and yada, yada. And so we actually were doing a webinar version at the end of the week and rejigged the whole thing and thought, we're actually not going to talk about systems change and all of this stuff. We just want to focus on bringing individuals and connecting them with their passion around the issue. And so we talked to people about what their passions were and their superpowers. And the whole thing was a really light touch. And the feedback we got were things like, I never knew you could use such almost childlike joy and excitement in a group to tackle such a hard issue. And I actually think it was my favorite workshop in my entire career of doing this kind of thing. And we chucked out the entire rule book. We never talked or taught or covered content. We just focused on connecting people. And it was absolutely mind-blowing and just reinforced for me again that we worry so much, like, what do people have to know? You've got to know this and you've got to know that. And I know that happens for me too, but it just reinforced it if we work on the people and the relational and connect them with each other and their passion around why they're involved, which is what you talked about at the start. That's the best start we can possibly make.
Beautiful. Because what you're making me think too, what you're making me think too is the foundations that we are building are the foundations for head, heart, and hands. It's not only the foundation for head, but it's around how do we bring people's passion into it, and how is there enough passion and enough understanding for people to then want to step and do something with it. So, David, what are your reflections?
It's my cue again. So I was hearing three key sort of themes, one around structures and processes, one around mindset, and one around power. So I'll attempt to sort of step through those a little bit. I think in terms of structure and process, Sharon, you were talking, sorry, I think it was Jen, you talked about building what you need when you need it. And, you know, I think that's really crucial. I think that that's one of the biggest mistakes that I've observed in this work, is that if you're doing collaboration or you're doing collective impact, there's a checklist and you have to have governance and you have to have data. And I think, you know, that's a great way to kill collaboration, in all honesty, is to provide too much structure too soon. And I'd probably link that to mention of a leadership table. And I think it was you, Sharon, that mentioned that, you know, I'm getting the names wrong. One of you mentioned that you know, you often have government and business and you have service providers and lived experience. And I think that's great somewhere down the track, you know, in terms of later stage collaboration. But again, I think you can kill projects by having that too early as well. Because what I've observed, and I realize that there are other views and other experiences, but what I've observed is when you get professionals in the room, it's really hard for them to step out of their role. It's actually much easier for community members often to do collaborative work. They know what they know, they're in the place, they have relationships, they have a real sort of felt experience. And professionals tend to bring baggage. And so for what it's worth, one of my tips would be don't bring the professionals into the room with community too early, because, you know, you've got to make sure that community are confident speaking up and pushing back against some of that formal power and some of the sort of mindsets that professionals bring. Might leave it there for now.
Love it, David.
Thank you. The segue to that. So we're now moving into phase 3, which is what's referred to as building a shared agenda, but it's actually where everything starts to gel together. Because the way, even in hearing you talk about it now, David, it's as if the first bit so far is finding our way and building relationships and connections with people, getting enough of an understanding, getting enough of what's working. But by the time we get about midway through, we want to start getting clearer. Or as I said to somebody last week, we want to be less confused, because this can be quite confusing with all of these things going on. And so by the middle, this is where our leadership table is starting to gel, I want to say. I'm even hesitant to use the word formalize, but we've got a bunch of committed people, and we start to think about how are we going to organize ourselves. But the bit that sometimes, this is where also I find that almost like the cracks start to show in our practice biases. So for example, if my background's community engagement, meaning I see it everywhere. And so what can happen is, if my passion is community engagement, I can engage forever, ask questions forever, but I might not be so comfortable stepping into the formalizing bit of things. And what I find here is that this is the stage where we want to think about, okay, we're getting clear on purpose. What are some of the mutually reinforcing strategies and activities that we can start to test and try to see if we can shift this thing that we want to change? I'm noting here, it's worth noting, I'm not using the word programs. So sometimes what happens is we come in with our program suitcase, like our solution suitcase, and we're holding it right from the start. We're like, I want to open the suitcase, I want to open the suitcase. This is about more than programs. Programmatic responses can't shift population level change. And so we want to understand how the money flows, how power is used. There are informal things we can be doing in communities that are still test and try and quick wins. But at some point, we've got to link this stuff to a goal. And we want to link it in a one-step, let's describe it as a 1 or 2 step leap. So we don't want to say, let's say our goal is, Sharon, you had an example at the start about kids in care or young people sleeping rough. It might be a leap if we're saying something like, we want to advertise in the local paper with nice thoughts about young people or something. Every time we do something, we want to ask the question, interesting idea. In what ways is your hypothesis that it's going to shift the goal? And what kind of changes are you looking for? So this is almost the part where we have to kind of own the organizing a little bit in our thinking and say, okay, we're doing all these things, but it's not just a great big menu of things we're trying. It's actually going, I'm doing this thing to shift the problem, not just because I was doing it and I want to keep doing it. And so we almost want to say it's like a bit ruthless in a way. Like we've got to get, while we're getting clear in all of this, we're also taking some things off the table as well. And so, yeah, that's my little spiel about.
Beautiful spieling,
That's what
Jennifer.
planning looks like. Sorry, I could speak about that forever. Over to you, Sharon.
Beautiful spieling. I often get asked around this part of the work, to do a shared agenda, do we do that at like the leadership table with all of our, data analysis and our systems mapping and our relationship mapping and our community conversation, and we come up with a shared agenda and take it out and socialise it? Or does the shared agenda need to come from the community and come back into the system? Like what's the way to build a shared agenda? And my response is wherever you start and however you do it is absolutely fine. But just know that it's only an agenda. It's not a shared agenda until it is shared. And it's only shared when people's heads, hearts, and hands are behind it. And that takes time, and it can take some conscious thinking about how are we going to move this from a few people or a few parts of the ecosystem so that we can actually get enough drive for it to become a movement of itself. And like everything else, it's really talking and listening to people. That's what it basically comes down to. And sometimes I see people say, well, and we're collaborating because we're all doing our bit to move this thing. There's a difference for me between whether you're doing this work as a collective or a collaboration. And both is fine. It doesn't matter how you're doing it. But a collective is often around people doing what they're doing and sewing the seams between all of those things really well. So they're putting in a collective effort. When you're collaborating, it's saying, I'm willing to set aside my walls and my boundaries to move whatever I need to move, even within myself and internally, to help make this thing happen. It's often at this stage that the major convenings come in really handy. Pulling together government in different layers, community, different layers, researchers, whoever it is. Often it's at this point that really helps. And the language of how you talk about your shared agenda then shifts over time. So, for example, in an initiative that I was a part of, the agenda that we took out was that children thrive and reach their full potential. When it became a shared agenda, the thing that got the energy was all of our children are loved and safe. So it's not that the intention changed, but the thing that was the shared agenda was expressed quite differently.
There's two things that stand out to me there, Sharon, and one is the word shared, because I've been exploring language with the group this week, and because we were talking about sharing power, and this is the same person that talked about making it visible, said, that's great, but sharing can be, hey, I gave you a little bite of my sandwich and I took the rest. It doesn't, so it's common. And I really like the way you're explaining what the shared really means, because the reality of all of this is it's movement building. All of this, we're going in the early stages from making the me a we. But a movement, one of my favorite quotes is, it's only a movement if it moves without you. And so that's why at every stage, whoever the group is that has kind of kicked this thing off or that's holding it in the early stages, the tighter you hold it as you go along, the more you reduce the chance that it's going to move without you. And the last thing you want, if all of this is around population level, systemic, intergenerational change, and you after 3 years, you're not funded to do that work anymore and the whole thing falls apart. We really need to be building that shared movement building. And it links to what David was talking about in the last summary around the role of community, because it was subtle in what you said, David, around almost don't bring the professionals in. And that actually implied that this thing was held by community. And I just wanted to point that out, that even implicit in what you were saying was that this is deeply the community is a partner from the start. And in the end, they're the owner as we go along. And so it's always founded in that, on that premise. And I just want to pull that out of the language.
Absolutely. I think the other thing in this for me is context is king and queen. So how the rhythm and how you do this depends on what has worked previously in this community. So having a sense of when things work well around here, what are the ingredients? You know, when you see something take off and the community owns it, what are the ingredients that happen around here? And you find that when you speak to communities, some of them are the same between different communities, but there will be some differences that are about this place and about how this place works. And they're really worth understanding and knowing so that you can fit into the what works well around here. And every community, no matter what the stats might say about them, has that stuff. So I think that that is worth holding. The other part that you made me think of too, Jennifer, is that wherever you start, if you start with community, the movement building questions that you're often asking is about how do we engage decision makers, government, council, you know, those sorts of people. And so your movement building can look different from if this thing starts in the service system and you're wanting to work with and play with community differently.
I always say to people, community development goes both ways. People always think of it as, oh, we've got to, you know, get the community ready. And I'm like, really? Because like 9/10 of the work I spend is with powerful decision makers, taking them on the journey. And so it's a two-way street. And I wanted to acknowledge in that as well, that one of the, I was thinking of where have I seen things trip up? And I've done some of these that were kicked off by government and held by government, and some that were kicked off by community and held by community. And what I learned was by the time you get to this middle bit, you got to have everybody, because you need policymakers for systemic change. You need community to actually do the bits. And that's why we're trying to build these diverse relationships from the start, because this is the point where you want to be having conversations with everybody. You now want people, I hesitate to say at the table, I don't mean literal table, but you need everybody in the conversation, because everyone ultimately is needed for their insight, for what they bring, for what the different parts of those formal systems hold. And so that bit is really important.
Can I just say, in terms of a community, and there's many that do this well, but in terms of really holding this part of the phase work, there's some work in Mackay in Queensland by an initiative called Youth Out Loud 1000 that people might want to have a look at, in terms of how they're constantly trying to build this agenda as a shared agenda in every piece that they do. Really worth having a look at. So I think it's time for our David.
Okay, some things that I heard. I liked where this began, which was by the midway point, things are becoming clearer or less confused. So not clear and not confused, just clearer and less confused. And I think that's really important. The second thing that I'd highlight was around the testing and trying that was mentioned. And I want to make a distinction, this is a little bit technical, but I think it's really important, between prototyping something and piloting something. Government really loves running pilots, and funding organisations will give you X amount of dollars, run a pilot for a year. Normally what a pilot means is something set up, it's a fully formed program, you try it out. If it works well enough, or it gets you good political mileage or whatever, then you fund its expansion, you roll it out. I think prototyping is different. Prototyping is about things that are not yet finished. So if you run a prototype, and this is, I guess, the well-known example in contemporary times is around technology. Lots of people who develop software, apps and things don't actually finish them. They kind of put a product out there that's good enough, and they see how people use it, and then they tweak it and change it. And I think that's more what we want to be doing, in the mid stage of this work. Things are not set in stone, they're prototypes. You can still change them, you can reword them, you can restructure them, you can do all sorts of things. And I think a part of that is running sort of activities or smaller initiatives that are safe to fail. Big part of this work is getting it wrong and learning from that. I think that there are no answers, once and for all. There are better ways of doing things, and there are paths that you can follow. Another quick book, just because it was here in my office. This is a really good book, really interesting. Success starts with failure. It's how you learn. It's how different stakeholders learn to work together. But moving things along, where does the shared agenda come from? I think is a great question. And the answer was it can come from anywhere, but it's not a shared agenda until it's shared. And so there's something really important in all of that I won't go into because it was said really well by others. There's also a really nice distinction, I think, between collective and collaborative approaches. And I think, collaboration, that idea of the walls coming down, and not just everyone else's, but your own. We haven't talked a lot about this, and we might come back to it later if there's time or interest in the questions. But I think a really key part of this work is self-work. I've been part of a number of projects, and I have done all the wrong things. And I'm not saying that, artificially. I'm quite genuine. If people want to ask any of the three of us questions about this, we'll all admit that we've stuffed just about every aspect of this up at one time or another. And, it's just acknowledging that and being okay with that and making sure that you don't waste the learning opportunity that it throws up. And finally, I think the thing that was mentioned, context is king. And again, I won't belabor that, but that's obviously what this work is all about, continually grounding it and regrounding it in local context. That doesn't just happen once at the beginning. Context changes, and you've got to change with the context. That could be new players in the community, different politics, funding coming, going, etc. So really important to ground and reground all of this work in local context.
Beautiful. So, Gabby, can we invite you in so that we could move into some questions, bring some questions in from our participants?
Oh, so we've got about 15 minutes now to talk through some of the questions, and then towards the end of the session, we'll be moving into scaling up and transformation to finish off with. So there was a question specifically about other books repower in community. I'm not sure if any of you have reference something off the top of your head, but I also mentioned that we will, any resources we think that might help answer questions people have, will collate into a blog post and Platform C and share. But if anyone knows about good references for power in community, anything comes to mind?
I can share a couple of key articles more than books. I don't know if David's got something he'd like to share.
No, look, I don't. I'd have to be honest. I'd have to think about it a bit more and look through what I've got. I've got lots of stuff floating around, as most of us do, but it doesn't mean it's all relevant.
We will take that on notice.
Can I just say that that's David's next PhD, because I've looked for stuff before, and most of the power stuff that's written about power is really about power, organisational power, even around systems. It's about organisation. So it's your next PhD, David.
So I've got just one to recommend, Julie Diamond's Power, a User Guide. It's a super practical, straightforward read. And it goes to what David's point was around the personal, that we bring ourselves into this work. So it wasn't, how to manage the power of others. It was a genuine exploration of power and our role in that. And just shout out to that one, because it's a great read.
It is actually, it's a very good one. Again, her background is more organisational power than changing power and community, but you're quite right, Jen.
It had a really good application.
Okay, so another question. There was a question earlier on when we were more in building readiness and building foundation stage. For equity in power for diverse people, we need to make it possible for people to express themselves in their own language, so that they can truly speak passionately about their idea. How do platforms allow for this?
Can I tell a story about that? And it's not my story. It's one that our colleague Kate Simpson talks about working up on, I want to say Groot or Galawinku, but it was the idea of how do we explore with people in multiple languages. And she told a story of a workshop where she was the only English speaker, but everything that was said was translated in 4 different languages. And so there were language facilitators around the room. And so it's just reiterating the point as well that it's almost like the facilitator is the least important, or the people holding it are the least important. And we're always gearing it towards what is required to have genuine conversations. And then how does everything get aimed at making sure that language, approach, culture are at the heart of that design, rather than having everyone step into your work. Because I think there have been some other questions along those lines as well, that we're stepping into community here, not community stepping into the big table or the big room or something like that.
I think the other thing this brings up for me too is that in the holding of this work, it's often called governance. And, you know, we often think of it as holding just the formal or sort of the fiduciary legal side of governance, when really it's holding that and collaborative governance. So how we're going to collaborate together, but it's also holding cultural governance. And I think we often don't think of the third arm and think of what does holding this culturally mean? What does holding this in the culture of this community and in the cultural identities of different parts of this community? Because sometimes it can be something quite simple. So, for example, holding your gatherings sitting in the dirt in a circle can be all that some folk need, or even just having the chairs in a circle without a table. So sometimes going a little bit helps people come in a lot. But that's not stepping away from what Jen was saying before. David, did you want to add anything to that?
I'll just add something quick, picking up on the last point that you made. Some years ago now, I was in Victoria, and I don't actually know where I was. I got roped into visiting some communities and talk about collective impact. And we walked into this room, and there was like a massive boardroom with about 25 people from government sitting around it. And we tried to have this, it was reasonably subtle, but this conversation with them about, you know, that being a bit problematic if you're just wanting to set out on a collective impact project. You know, people in suits, tables with papers all over them, very formal meeting, very structured and planned. And the people in the room looked at us like we were complete idiots. It's like, you know, why did we get you to come and talk to us? You know, you have no place here. Like, we're the experts, get out. And straight away you could see, like, that was just the wrong place to run a collaborative or a collective impact project. And so I just wanted to highlight that sometimes the sitting in the dirt, but also the visual cues and the other cues that you give people when you bring them together are really important. And if you start a collective or collaborative project in that sort of fashion, you're going to alienate community from the beginning. And so I think there's something about settings, physical settings, as well as, you know, social dynamics and other aspects of setting.
Actually, David, just quickly, Gabby, you reminded me I've made a big mistake the other way as well, where I've made things too community and have really scared the bureaucrats and the CEOs to the point where one CEO of a large organisation decided they couldn't come to the meeting because it wasn't professional enough. So I think, you know, it's around how you hold that diversity rather than become all of one or all of the other.
And to bridge, I just want to make one bridging point, sorry, Gabby, on that, is the idea of decolonizing this work. Because in all of this, we do what we know. We build a governance table, we hold a meeting. You know, your point around cultural governance, Sharon, was incredibly powerful. And so we have to be challenging ourselves also about what do we mean by this idea of governance? What do we mean by a leadership table? And to David's point about that then guides how we act and behave. And who is the we as well? So just constantly challenging our thinking on that. Sorry, I'll stop talking. Gabby, what questions have you got?
We've got a bit of time. So maybe I'll just pick one that builds on that a little further. Is there a planned process where capacity of communities are built or developed so they can speak for themselves, particularly in light of David's reflection on how professionals bring baggage and Sharon's on the importance of understanding context.
Can I jump in on that to link it to, oh, sorry, David. Oh, I just want to link it to exactly what I was thinking, because in the last comment, because this came up last week for me as well with one that we were doing. And it came about because community was being brought in to the big formal process. And so that was the one that we actually rejigged and did it completely differently the second time and just thought about it differently. And so I think inherent in all of that are we want community to speak for themselves, but actually we kind of need to get everybody else out of the way rather than building up. There's kind of a risk in wanting to build people up so they can have their voice. We actually need to step back and make space. And I think that links to the point about bringing decision makers along to understand that community lived experience is expertise and it's critical. So we want to find ways to have the conversation with people in ways that they're comfortable. And I find it's just, I think about it differently than rather, how do I get community ready? So there's something in the mindset and view on that. David, you were going to say something.
Just in terms, I think in the question there was something about processes or frameworks, and I really like, but don't think it's perfect at all, the Harwood material, the Harwood approach. Lots of holes in it, like with all of these things, but I think they really get the orientation right. There's a quote that Rich Harwood uses. It's something like making the community your reference point and not your boardroom. And there's a community conversations toolkit, and people on the webinar might know all of this, but I think it's a really great community conversations toolkit that gives you lots of tips around how to go and ask the community real questions, how to form that into a community narrative that you can then share with government and others to promote the community's interests and frame them in a way that's sort of legitimate, because it's coming from them. It's through conversation with them that it's formed. So I think that's certainly something that we'll include when we communicate with you after the webinar, some links to some Harwood material.
Beautiful. Can I just add, I was involved in an initiative where we did a whole lot of orienting the community to how to come into this work and how to work together, and did a whole lot of support around people who are showing up as community leaders to be able to bring their voice into the various tables, etc. And what we found was we had assumed that people from government departments and service leaders would know how to play differently. And we had developed the community, but hadn't developed anybody else. So one of the things that I would recommend is that it's around how everyone learns how to collaborate. It's not only about how do community learn how to do this, it's how does everybody learn how to collaborate. And the best way to step in to work out what that is to ask the people that you're working with themselves, how do you want to collaborate? And what is it that we know? There is actually a tool on Platform C around assessing how people have collaborated in the past that I think is very useful. But just think about it across your entire initiative, not only hone in on the community.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next one. It came up during the shared agenda phase, but I'm not sure if it's specific to that. There was a question about, can you speak to founder fever, where a founding member holds power very tightly and tries to shut down conversations and collaboration to the point of being kind of rude, bullying, and moving into that kind of territory?
Can I just say that I have been living with some of that at the moment with some of the work that I'm doing, and I can say I share your pain. It's a really hard one, particularly because often to be a founder and to get something complex off the ground at a time that you've got no resources and you've only got a couple of people in there with you, it does need to be held tightly to help you get it there. But when it gets, you get a bit of resourcing in and you're having these conversations and you're wanting to broaden it out, it can be really challenging for some founders to let go of holding it, controlling it all, etc.
That question came up from someone that's experiencing that in an NFP at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I can say is how I've been tackling it with this particular initiative is looking for openings to have conversations about it and to bring it overtly and to talk about it in terms of the initiative and the work, not in terms of the individuals or a particular organisation, and to call out what is needed. As we transition to the next phase of the work, the amazing work that people have done at holding this tightly needs to transition as well. So how do we work to let go? How do we bring others in? What would that look like? A very complex one, though. I completely share your pain. Jennifer and David, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, look, it's funny that Jen's on the call, because we talked about this at length a few years ago. The project that I was working on was really top heavy. So, formal governance took place, in a high-rise building in the Sydney CBD for a project that was, out in the suburbs, a highly disadvantaged community. And it just felt like all the shots were being called from, miles away. And it just felt really inappropriate. And I'll be the first to admit, it took me a long time to figure out how to deal with that. And, in the end, there were a couple of things. One was, I mentioned Harwood Community Conversations before. I wanted to do those in some specific communities, and I was told not to. And so one part of my response to what was going on was I just decided that, for my own ethical reasons, I needed to ignore the directive I was given. And we went and did some community conversations because it was a way of trying to rebalance things. That's not always the answer, but part of it was, if I'm going to do this job, I'm breaking that rule. It's just not something I'm prepared to live with. A more sort of systematic and appropriate, if you like, and strategic way of dealing with it was we ended up calling one of these big all-in sort of workshops that had, 50 odd people at it. And we made sure that was based in the community, and some of the suits from the city wouldn't come. And so that was fine. Their voices were not included. And, we worked through systematically throughout a 6 or 8 hour period. Okay, what is the purpose of this work that we're doing? Who's close to the ground? Who understands? What ideas do we have? What's been generated locally? We sort of systematically talked about governance and experiences, what we'd learned to date. And at the end of that workshop, we came up with we were calling it a governance structure. I wouldn't now, but we came up with a new governance structure. And the funders actually accepted that. So, if this has been developed with 50 people and we've said that we're funding collaboration, we can't argue with it. So for me, I don't know if that will work in the scenario that of the person that asked the question, but it was how do we find a way of using the ethos, if you like, of the work that we're doing to generate a better outcome.
And what you picked, oh, sorry, do we still have time to keep going on that question, Gabby?
Yeah, we've got to fit one more in. We've got 3 minutes all up.
Okay, so, just to build on that, what you did, David, there was you worked with what you had. You leveraged something, so you leveraged what they care about. You knew that if you took it out in community, you used what was agreed and repurposed it. And that was what I would suggest as well. Like if the goal is sustainability, if the goal is growth, how then are we ensuring that this work is shared, that the conversations are shared, that we're embracing diversity sufficiently? It does make me question the idea of if this is one person and they're, say, the chair, you've got some challenges there around perceptions around governance and facilitation, because it should be, this process is more shared. It's not really ever owned by a person, because if it is, it's not shared, and it sounds very fixed. So I always want to say this isn't your grandmother's governance. This wave, and there's a paper on collaborative governance that's on Platform C that actually takes you through step by step what governance looks like in this way of working that might be helpful, and it might give you some questions as well. It was written for communities, so it should be accessible. Sorry, Gab.
That's okay. So we've got one more, and Jen, this was building on your comment about getting government ready. Any suggestions for getting government ready to take more risk? Who wants to take that one on?
Yeah, actually, because I saw that one come through the chat, and one of the things I thought about was what I've found working with government is there are barriers to how things work, how money flows. There are some things that are really pretty solid, and when we get a bunch of people in a room who want to do things differently, it can actually make people feel really badly, like they get frustrated. And so one of the things I found really helpful is we map the limits. We map here's what we're trying to do. What can you do? What are your barriers as you perceive them? And we could do group problem solving. We could find if one entity can't do something, another one can. But rather than like hide the challenges around that or the barriers to sometimes what is pretty simple, like getting a piece of comms out that has to be validated by 50 people and approved by 6. We've got to think differently. Recently, one of the groups I was working with said, that's great. You know what? The community partner can do the comms. We don't actually need to do it. And it eliminated the challenge. So we can collectively work together. But I do find it helps to acknowledge all of that and problem solve it together as a group. What about you, David and Sharon?
One of the most powerful conversations I've had around this was when I saw a community leader say to the government decision makers, what can I do from my position to make your lot easier? And what it took is it changed the power balance in the room, but it also took the pressure of government to deliver on what is not deliverable. What we often do around our tables is we often have, in Victoria, I'm in Victoria, but we often have at most levels 5 to 7, which are sort of like middle level bureaucrats. And a middle level bureaucrat can only fire the bullets that they are allowed to fire. And we often expect from those bureaucrats something that they cannot deliver on. So some of the barriers, some of the systems questions that we're challenging people on, like why can't we fund organisations differently, might be way and above the punch weight of these people. And so there's often questions about who is it in government that we need to speak to, and do we do this as one initiative, or do we collate the initiatives that are happening in the state around this issue to tackle that? And who might be the intermediaries or the other bodies around Australia or the state that are also looking at the same thing? So some of those broader system issues, it's beyond the folk that you have around your table, and it's thinking strategically about who do you need to have help you with that.
Just really, really quickly, one of the things, I worked in government, state government for 15 years on, amongst other things, place-based projects. And one of the things that I'd observe is that no matter how much traction you get with government, there are always going to be changes in staff, and there are always going to be changes of government, of ministers and elected governments. And you're never going to settle things once and for all. So I think something that's really important, in addition to what we've already said, is really making, if you like, for want of a better way of putting it, government relations part of the work. It's not that you'll sign a partnership agreement and everything will be good. It'll be outdated, superseded, ignored, or whatever. So part of it is positioning your initiative to have a good relationship with whoever is in the public service and whoever is in the government.
Thank you. Thanks. We got through all the questions that were posted, so that's great and good timing. So for the last section, we're on track to finish on time. For the last section, hand back to Jen and Sharon.
Beautiful. Thanks. They were great questions, weren't they? It's terrific. The last sort of 2 parts of the collaborative change cycle that we wanted to speak about are around scaling for systems change and achieving transformation. And the reason that we have pulled these after the questions and as a separate part of the conversation is the first 3 phases that we've spoken about. So the building readiness, the building foundations, and the shared agenda piece are often where the work runs around quite a bit. And it can be that you have a readiness to do some work. You've built the foundations, then you have a shared agenda that you find moves over time, and you've got to go back and redo some of your foundations, or that there's not the readiness that you had suspected, so you've got to go and see where that readiness now is, or as David says, something in the system changes. Where the work then moves into scaling up. Firstly, the word scaling comes from manufacturing. And so it very much is about doing more of the same. What scaling up looks in this work is doing more, and it may not be the same, but you have more people doing more things that are around the shared agenda that you have that people are working towards. And what you start to see when things are scaling up is you start to see things happening towards this shared agenda that the initiative didn't start, didn't initiate, are not driving. Then when it becomes transformational, you start to see that it is the way that things are done around here. No one steps in to doing anything with children without doing this particular thing. So Jen, did you want to talk to that?
One of the things that struck me about this, I love your explanation of scaling, is someone said recently, you scale the practice, not the process. And so it's all this investment in the ways of working that we've really fought hard for in the first three phases, and we've really, lost a bit of sleep and a bit of hair and all of that sort of stuff. That's where it pays off, because we want to scale how we work together. And we want to do more of the good things that worked in in how we worked, and these things we've tried to create around ways of working and mindset. And that's what gets us going, rather than, like you say, people think, oh, we're going to now roll it out like public policy across the community and, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, no, it's not a factory, to your point. So that was the big thing that struck me at this phase. And also it's a bit of a holding phase as well. Like it's almost like between phase 3 and 5, there's a step, and we just want to pause. So we're not revving the engine of our V8 car. We're just going to check it out first. Make sure the car is geared to where we want to go. We take a breath at this phase too. So at this phase as well, it sounds like we're gearing up, but we do it with consideration, and it's a bit of a pause point, and we want to make sure we've got the bits in place that we're going to need.
And so the other thing that I see too, Jen, is if the movement pieces have been done along the way, right from the very beginning of the identification of the readiness, things can start scaling even when you're still building the foundations. If there's been a hit on something that's really critical and really important, you can find that some things start catalyzing pretty quickly, and you can just let them fly. Whereas for some other work, particularly the work that's got multiple players across the system, to scale that, it might be, we are going to, as you say, scale the way that we're having conversations about this. Or we're going to see if we can get the voice of First Nations people around every table, that sort of stuff. Not only in our initiative, but, across the work. So it's different for different parts of the work I've seen, is how it's played out.
It's also the phase where it's all going to fall apart if you haven't done the work in the start. You won't get past the middle, because I'd written, as you were talking, Sharon, it challenges our idea of control. Like imagine, and it goes to the question that was asked about how I read control. Because if imagine in the early stages, people are coming going, oh, I want to try this and I want to try that. And somebody is going, no, that's not part of our agenda. That's not on the plan. You've already killed off all your goodwill and innovation. And by the time you get to this phase, you got nothing. There's nothing left. So people aren't coming with their ideas. Nobody wants to bring something new and different because they've been shut down. So this is where everything we didn't do earlier on, we may even get as far as making a plan and, thinking it's the shared agenda. And then we're going to try to do something with it. And we've missed all the subtle ingredients that are required. So that's why that that idea of controlling the things that are happening early on. Like, we've just got to hold this stuff loosely, because the whole point of all of this is to learn about how do we shift the problem or the issue we're trying to shift. And to do that, we've got to be open and try a bunch of different things from the start. So we're holding everything really loosely, and it pays
You
off
know,
here.
what you're making me really realise too, Jen, is in a way the how to do scaling and transformational change is in the first 3 phases. And what you're doing in the scaling up and the transformational change is often observational. You're looking for things. You're looking for evidence of things happening that didn't start with you, or you're looking for evidence that people are starting to pick up and do things in a certain way. It's very much, as you say, the fruit of your labour time. David, did you want to say anything to this?
Look, certainly I agree with what's been said. I scribbled a few notes in case you switch back to me. Let me have a quick look at them. A couple of things. I really liked, Sharon, the explanation of scaling, as I think Jen said, talking about, transformation and a new normal. You know that you sort of achieve transformation when business as usual is really different to how business as usual used to be. Scale the practice, not the process. And a little quote that I wrote down: if you haven't done the early work, this is where it all falls apart. So really all I can do is concur with the comments that both of you have made. One thing that I was going to say before, I'll just say really quickly, is people have mentioned the holding environment a couple of times. And I think there can be a little bit of confusion about what that is. And I think in its origins, it comes from child psychology, where the holding environment is not always, but often the family that provides a safe environment for the child to grow in. So the child's going to make mistakes, they're going to stuff up, but there are people in the family that will create a holding environment that will enable them to learn from their mistakes and to develop in a healthy way. And I think it's really important to remember that in this work. The holding environment is about holding things steady enough for the mess to go on inside and be worked out rather than spilling outside. Sort of keeping it within the family. When kids are throwing their temper tantrums, or as they get older, they're doing some naughty things and experimenting or what have you. It's just keeping that safe enough. And I think that's important. So yeah, the holding environment is there the whole way throughout these projects. But, by the time you get to the sort of pointy end of the spectrum, and there's a lot in place, you kind of don't need the holding environment. It's a bit like, the child reaches 21 and it's like, okay, like you're on your own now. Like we've given you all that you need. Now it's time for you to live your life. And it's a bit like that with these projects. But in all honesty, you don't see many that get to adulthood. And I think that there's something in creating the holding environment that will mature these projects all the way through to adulthood and to independence.
And sometimes too, it's aspects of it. So there's a question that's come through about, have you ever seen transformational change? And the answer is yes. And an example that I'd like to give was around play groups. So in this particular community, there were play groups, and there were also supported play groups because of the data in this community. So there were government funded play groups, and the play groups were attended by the same mums, a couple of dads, but basically by the same mums throughout the community. And they were a part of this initiative, which was and still is called Go Goldfields, around social change to improve outcomes for children. And so they had been a part of all of this process, and they had conversations amongst themselves around, what do we do? Because we see a lot of mums and dads around town with little kids that we never see come to the playgroups. And the intervention that they decided on was, if they saw a mum or dad around town with kids their, playgroup age, they would say hello. And a couple of them tried it first. Some were a bit more hesitant. And then one of them who tried it brought a story back, a story of significant disadvantage of this mum. And to cut a long story short, her opinion of this mum changed from she's, not a good mum, really rough, to actually she's holding a lot of things that I don't know that I could deal with, and I will do everything I can to help her. So what happened was that community now has bursting at the seam playgroups with very diverse parents going, and that's got nothing to do with the service system at all, never has had. They took a way of working and applied it to the stuff that they wanted to change in their community.
I love that. I was thinking, if I think about transformational success, it reminded me of a story I think I heard you tell at a conference in Melbourne, Sharon, which is where I met you actually, around stopping doing stuff. Because sometimes I know we think, initiative gets to phase 5, so it's successful. Sometimes they stop. And so was it you that had told a story about the initiative stopped or transformed what they were doing? Can you share that?
I don't know the particular story, but I do know that some of the most powerful work that I was involved in that time was stopping the things that were not working. There are so many self-perpetuating dysfunctional either programs or they were good, things were good and they did do much good, but that much good has stopped now because there's a different need in the community. And there's, I don't know the particular example, but I know at that phase of the work, we were looking at what are the things we need to start doing? What are things we need to keep doing? What are the things we need to keep doing but change? And what are the things we need to stop doing? So it was in an environment of, it wasn't only the stopping doing, it was in an environment of asking questions across all of the work that we were doing.
Can I add something quickly? I know we're about to get to the end.
Yep.
Something that I wanted to just slide in there. In thinking about the sort of qualities, characteristics, skills that it takes to do this, I think something that stands out for me that I just wanted to mention is a not so technical term, which is hustle. I think in all the work that we normally do, there is an organization. If you work for an NGO, if you work for government, there's a structure, you come along and you do your bit. This work is not always, but is often outside of that. It's creating something new, and very few people know what it takes to actually build all of your own infrastructure for this sort of work. And it requires someone, sort of mentioned before, who's completely focused on purpose and will keep pulling all the pieces together. And that's a really active role. And unless or until you get to the new normal, that's essential. You can't do this without that. And so I just wanted to sort of mention that to people, that every project needs it could be someone senior or not so much, but they need the gopher who will just keep pulling things together, who will keep on things, keep on it and on it and on it. Because this stuff doesn't manage itself. This stuff doesn't, you don't just set it off and it's got momentum and it keeps going. It needs to be re-energized constantly.
Thanks, David. I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks, everyone. And particular thanks to Jen, Sharon and David. And thank you to Michelle from CFI, the coordinator and support behind getting the webinar up and running. We've had several requests for a video recording and some with a time frame of tomorrow morning. We will do our best to get an email link out to you, hot off the press. So keep an eye on your inbox. Michelle will drop her link for a feedback form into the chat, and that link will also be in the email out to you along with the video link. If you have time before you leave and the inclination, if you're like dropping 1 or 2 words into the chat that sort of indicates something that you've learned today or a response to the inputs and experience in conversation today, that would be great. But we're really, really grateful for your participation in our first Platform C webinar. Stay tuned. We'll be running some more next year. And thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Oh, and one other thing, we won't have it ready by tomorrow, but we will do a blog post on Platform C and incorporate some of the resources and references material that relates to today as well, which we'll share. Jen?
Well, while you're all, if you're staying on to drop a word into the chat, I wanted to acknowledge, and I meant to do this at the start, the deep expertise of all of you on the webinar today. The magic, if there's any, that Sharon, David, and I bring, it's magic from learning from failure. It's magic from learning from doing. And you guys on the call today, you're out there learning from doing. And so there are things that you're doing that you're learning from that are incredibly powerful, and skills that you all have. And so it's also very much a case of acknowledging and finding those too. So we wanted to acknowledge the bravery in all of this, and the fact that there's always things that people are doing that are bringing the magic to, I want to say, the magic to this mess. And that we are learners on this journey, as well, as you've heard from us today. So thank you. And Sharon and David, is there anything you wanted to add as we close out?
I think that was a great closing. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, guys. Have an awesome day wherever you are, whatever time zone you're in. And hopefully we'll see you again one day. Take care.